Let's begin by looking at three very different early societies: Mesopotamian, Mayan, and Roman. These three societies have many differences according to things like culture, as well as different means of survival tailored to their living conditions, but also have many stark similarities. But if these countries are so far away from each other, how is it that things like the social classes developed in such a resembling way to one another? Could they have met? Did they even communicate? To discover this, we must first learn of what life in each society entailed and how these people interacted from day to day. Mesopotamia means land between rivers, which is appropriate as the state lay between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The earliest village settlements appear in North Mesopotamia from around 8000 BC, when the first farmers settled in the low rolling hills of the north. The first cities developed, however, around 3,500 years ago, mostly in the fertile plains of the south, as the rainfall patterns in the north were irregular and unpredictable. These plains were named the Fertile Crescent, where there were many rivers and marshes which provided water to irrigate crops and reeds to build houses and boats. Civilization emerged in Mesopotamia because the soil provided a surplus of food, one of the main reasons societies and permanent settlements originate. With this surplus, people could settle down to village life, and with these new settlements, towns and cities began to make their appearance, a process known as urbanization. With settlements and a surplus of food came an increase in the population, a well-defined division of labour, organisation, cooperation, and kingship. Over 13,000 kilometres away, some of the earliest farming villages of the Maya were concentrated in what is now known as Belize. Much of Maya history is shrouded in mystery, although it is believed today that the Maya people began to settle in the Yucatan area of what is now Mexico between 2600 BC and 1800 BC. The Maya area is generally divided into three loosely defined zones: the Southern Maya Highlands, the Central Lowlands, and the Northern Lowlands. The Southern Maya Highlands include all the elevated terrain in Guatemala. The Southern Lowlands lie just north of the highlands and incorporate the Mexican states of Campeche and Quintana Roo, and northern Guatemala, Belize, and El Salvador. The Northern Lowlands cover the remainder of the Yucatan Peninsula. As the population grew, farmers found it even more difficult to grow enough food to feed the growing population. Farming was difficult in the Maya region. There were dense forests, little surface water such as rivers and lakes, and the soil was poor. But the Maya were clever. The Maya did not try to use one system of agriculture. The farmers in each city-state fit their system to the land. In the mountainous highlands, they used step farming so that each step would be flat and able to be irrigated to better grow and harvest crops. In the swampy lowlands, the Maya built raised earth platforms surrounded by canals on which they could grow crops. In the dense forest, they used the slash and burn technique to create a flat surface to plant crops. They dug canals throughout the fields to irrigate the crops. In contrast, the form of Mesopotamian agriculture advanced due to their dependence upon domesticated animals and cereals as time went on, as their previous hunter-gatherer lifestyle was slowly replaced by the need to keep animals and grow cereals. The first evidence for ploughs in Mesopotamia only appears at the end of the 4th millennium BC as pictographs on the clay tablets from Uruk. It is a beam ard, a simple machine which scratches a furrow without turning the soil, and this changed little in design throughout the whole of Mesopotamian history. They were pulled by oxen. Seed ploughs, with a funnel through which seeds were dropped into the furrow, are depicted on seals from at least 2300 BC onwards. From around 4000 BC, milk from sheep, goats, and cows was used to make butter. Meat was largely reserved for the elite. They ate sheep, goats, beef, and poultry. Delicacies included gazelle, mice, and locusts. During the agrarian period, the amount of power you held over the production of food contributed to your place in the societal hierarchy that was developed. This was because the power one held over an aspect of agriculture affected the livelihood of those living in the society, as means of survival was no longer attributed to how much game a person could catch in order to feed the family. This concept was largely influential on the development of the Roman Empire, which first originated as a society of small farmers around 753 BCE. However, as it grew more powerful and more extensive, it became one of the most urbanized societies in the pre-industrial world. The Roman economy was based primarily on agriculture. For the Romans, this was the typical Mediterranean farming of the ancient world, cultivating grains, vines, and olives, and keeping sheep, goat, and cattle. The fields were ploughed with an ard-type plough similar to that of the Mesopotamians. Romans used mostly slaves to work in the fields. Slaves were widely available as they provided cheap labour to work their fields. An ubiquitous feature of Roman society was slavery. Slavery would have been found everywhere, in the cities and in the country, and of course in the home. They worked in all kinds of businesses and did all kinds of work, from unskilled labouring through to high-level professional jobs. They had no legal rights, they were property like cattle. Slaves were at the very bottom of the social ladder, a structure of basic class distinctions which remained in place throughout almost all of Roman history. The people were majorly divided among two classes, namely upper class and lower class, where there was a huge distinction between the two in terms of wealth and position. The upper class was further categorised as the senators and equites, whilst the lower class was divided into subdivisions such as plebeians, freed people, and slaves. Senators were also referred to as nobles, and was the umbrella all the political and royal families came under. Similarly, Mayan societies acquired a distinctive hierarchical and stratified organisation that varied in complexity but essentially remained the same over the millennia that followed. This organisation was reflected in different individual occupations. In these societies, most of the population worked as farmers, mainly cultivating maize, beans, squash, and peppers. In these hierarchical societies, farmers who also worked as artisans were required to pay the noble classes a tribute in form of goods and labour. The nobles, who often claimed they were descended from the gods and were exempt from farm work, devoted their time to an array of activities such as political and religious administration, artwork, war, and the trade of luxury goods, conducted in the form of exchange and without using coinage. Political and ritual activities like bull playing led to the rise of ruling groups whose power had gained hereditary status. These noblemen, supposedly descended from the gods, dominated the local political scene through networks of alliances and patrons. The rigid differences were reflected in clothing and ornaments, whose use was strictly regulated. For example, only nobility could wear sandals, decorated capes, rich headdresses, and jade and turquoise jewellery. It should also be noted that slavery was rare and economically insignificant, which is a striking contrast to the lives of the Romans who depended upon slaves for almost every need. Slavery for the Maya was limited to prisoners of war and debtors, but in many cases they could reign their freedom. Even though each society had various differences within their societal structures due to varying amounts of complexity and culture incorporated, the form of hierarchy is prevalent in almost every early society. In Mesopotamia, as the land closest to the river was the most fertile, there was a variation in terms of the wealth of these early farmers, which led to a distinct social class. The Mesopotamian social structure was highly stratified. There were the high-class gentry, the middle class, and the lower class. The government officials, the king, the priests, landowners, and the wealthy traders and merchants formed the upper strata of society. The middle class consisted of fishermen, farmers, artisans, and potters and scribes, or those who were involved in documenting records in the language prevalent during the period. The lowest class comprised of slaves, people without land and children, as well as prisoners who were captured after the prolonged wars that took place to wrest control of city-states. Slaves were regarded as bounty from wars, and they were brought in and made to work for wealthy merchants and priests. The Mesopotamian social pyramid, however, had at its top the priestly class. They were the ones who were the safekeepers of all gods housed in temples. Priests wielded a lot of clout, and they were supposed to be the know-all and be-all of religion and interpreted God's commands. With religion being the main force, the priests were the highest authority and they were looked upon to control floods by appeasing the gods. Floods and natural calamities and widespread destruction were blamed on God's wrath, which only the priests could pacify. Temples were replaced after about 1,000 years by the palace. The responsibility for the well-being and success of the social order was shifting from gods to people. Mesopotamian religious practices varied through time and distance, as it was basically characterized by polytheism, its mythology suggesting a number of gods and goddesses. Gods represented places and powers in ancient Mesopotamia. This idea is also represented in the Romans' worship of gods and goddesses. Roman religion was very similar to that of the Greeks, as they also worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, headed by the chief of gods, Jupiter. Other gods included Minerva, goddess of wisdom and learning, Mars, god of war, Venus, goddess of love, Ceres, goddess of the earth, and Pluto, god of the underworld. As well as these major gods, numerous lesser deities, gods of heath and home, the forest and field, populated the spirit world. Both of these cultures represented the notion of polytheism, meaning multiple gods. This idea was also carried on by the Maya, who worshipped more than 165 gods. The Mayans' religion involved several aspects of nature, astronomy, and rituals. Most gods represented a form in nature, such as the sun or maize. Like the Aztec and Inca who came to power later, the Maya believed in a cyclical nature of time. The rituals and ceremonies were very closely associated with celestial and terrestrial cycles, which they observed and inscribed as separate calendars. The Maya priest had the job of interpreting these cycles and giving a prophetic outlook on the future or past, based on the numerous relations of all their calendars. The Maya practiced human sacrifice. In some Maya rituals, people were killed by having their arms and legs held while a priest cut the person's chest open and tore out his heart as an offering. It is known that the Maya believed that the cosmos had three major planes: the earth, the underworld beneath, and the heavens above. One of the next steps these civilizations took in turn was the development of writing of a language that had been developed over thousands of years. This was a crucial point in the maintenance of history and culture within these societies, as they were now able to record and map ideas and stories that no longer needed to be passed along through word of mouth. Mesopotamians had cuneiform, which was initially created to record transactions, like how many goats were traded for wheat. Writing and reading are not things that everyone can do, so they created a further class distinction, as written language played an important role in widening the gap between the classes. In Roman society, the ability to read and write followed this idea, as the ability to write and read indicated education and intelligence that was only available to the children of wealthier parents. Roman literature is written in the Latin language. The Latins were people who had settled in central Italy some centuries before Rome was founded. Rome was originally one of their towns, and although the Romans came to be of somewhat mixed Italian stock, Latin, Sabine, Etruscan, they spoke the Latin dialect. The Maya writing system, often called hieroglyphs from a superficial resemblance to the ancient Egypt writing system, is the only writing system of the pre-Columbian New World which is known to represent the spoken language of its community. This advancement through all three societies created a foundation for the transmission of information, as well as an easier way to communicate with separate civilization, which led to collective learning. Even though all three societies were extremely different in culture, language, and infrastructure, we can clearly see the links between the different aspects that can be explored within them. These links emphasize the power of the human brain and its development into that of a modern human, as practically all civilizations during the agrarian period found some way to tailor these methods of development and survival to their lifestyles. These human societies began in drastically different places, but were brought together through their similarities, as well as their differences, which all contributed to all aspects of modern society we know today.